Okay, thank you all for coming back from lunch. Hopefully all the food that you have eaten and consumed is not going to make you too drowsy. We're going to be talking about risk assessment here today. And this is really an introduction to risk assessment, how risk assessment scales are developed, for example. We're going to be talking about that, why you do want to use risk assessment scales. Quickly, I'm Chris Henning. I am a professor at Portland State University and the chair of the Criminology Criminal Justice Department. I'm here with my colleague Ryan Lebrecht, who is also a professor at Portland State University. I apologize, I have to hold this microphone up here, so I'm not used to holding a microphone because I can speak very loudly when I need to my class. So here's our agenda for today. We're university professors. We like to be structured in terms of what we do. We're going to hit you with a lot of PowerPoint slides because students like to have PowerPoint slides now. They don't take notes themselves. They just ask for our slides. So we put them all in slides. So we're really here today to address a couple of things. First, what is risk assessment? Why do we need to be doing it as a system? How are agencies and organizations doing risk assessment currently? How should they be doing risk assessment? We want to talk about how risk scales are developed, risk assessment scales are developed. How do you evaluate whether or not a new risk assessment scale is any good or not? And then try and talk about how an agency, perhaps your agency, could go about starting to use a risk assessment. How do you choose? There's lots and lots of risk assessment scales out there. How do you know you're getting a good one? So that's our agenda for today. Start off with the first point. When we talk about risk assessment, we are really talking about prediction. And we do a lot of prediction in many areas of our lives. Every time you turn on the news to watch the weather, they are giving you a prediction, a weather forecast. This is NOAA's precipitation predictions 1 month out. They're trying to figure out the areas of the country that are going to get a lot of water and maybe areas that are going to get too little water. That's prediction. We do prediction when you go buy life insurance. If you've ever had to go do that, they take your blood, they ask you a whole bunch of questions. They want to try and predict how long you're going to live, and they're going to set the rate based on that. Same thing with driving, right? With buying your car insurance. They have figured out from prediction models that males are not as good of a bet as females when it comes to insurance rates. They're going to adjust your rates according to that. Prediction is everywhere. Ryan and I are Patriots fans, so don't get mad at us. But we predicted that win, and we were accurate in our prediction, of course, although it was a little sketchy there in the middle of the game, I admit. Had my doubts. All right? I mean, even when you go online to order a book at Amazon or try to get a Netflix movie, there's prediction going on because they make suggestions to you, right? Those suggestions are being predicted based on research. What kind of movies, what kind of books would you potentially enjoy? And they're using models to do that. So prediction is a part of life for us today. Prediction is also something that we do a lot in the criminal justice system. And that's what we're really talking about with risk assessment. We are basically, when we're talking about risk assessment, and Stephen Hart has described and defined it as basically risk assessment is an attempt to identify the probability that a given offender will engage in a certain type of behavior within a defined time period. All right? Now, in this case, it's pretty easy to tell. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to predict this one. This person's going to take something out of the house. It's just a guess, but I'm pretty sure I'm accurate in terms of that. All right? So that's what we're talking about in terms of what is risk assessment. I want to take a little look, though, and break down this definition. The first thing to pay attention to is the word attempt. We are attempting to predict some future outcome. That implies that there will be errors. No matter which system you use, and we'll talk about different strategies for predicting outcomes for cases, for offenders, suspects, but no matter which system you use, you're going to have some errors. And there's different kinds of errors. You can err in two different ways. You can say somebody's really high risk, and they turn out that they really aren't. That's what we call a false positive. Or you can say somebody's low risk, they're safe, and they turn out to do something horrible. That's a false negative. We will always have false positives and false negatives in our system, but our job should be to try and figure out the ways to minimize those errors. We should be thinking about the strategies that do the best job in terms of increasing our accuracy. All right? That's the first thing to understand. Errors will occur in any approach we use. Second thing, probability. Humans are just too darn complex to be able to predict with any kind of 100% accuracy. They used to try and do that, though. There's a famous case of Thomas Barefoot, who shot and killed a police officer, and a psychiatrist named James Grigson. They called him Dr. Death, because every single court case he ever testified in for a death penalty case, he said something basically along the lines, I am 100% absolute, no doubt about it, this person will recidivate with a new crime if you let him out. We are not that good at predicting human behavior. We've gotten better, and we will never get that good where we're perfect. Not even with the Minority Report, Tom Cruise, the whole, pre-crimes unit. We aren't going to get there like that, all right? We're not going to get perfect at this. By the way, Dr. James Grigson was, they don't disbar them, they take away their medical license, because this is unethical to say with absolute certainty something like this, all right? So we're talking about probabilities. We're making estimates about the likelihood of something happening instead of saying that it's happening. That should always be the case in any kind of risk assessment we do, probabilities. Next up, we usually try and predict a specific type of behavior. That behavior could vary depending upon the nature of the risk assessment and what your agency does. If you work for a sex offender unit, you might be interested in trying to predict a new violent offense or a new sexual offense. If you work in pretrial release, you might be interested in trying to predict a failure to appear. The methods that you use to predict one type of outcome may be slightly different than what you use for another type of outcome, which suggests that the risk scales that we use or the risk strategies we use should be specific to the outcome that you're interested in. We might not have a scale that does everything or an approach that does everything equally well. It should be tailored. We also usually are interested, and it varies by agency, in terms of the time frame under which you're interested in making predictions. Sometimes we're interested in predicting what will happen, the likelihood of an offense within the next year. Sometimes it's the next 3 years or 5 years. That really is also variable by agency and should be considered when you're looking at different types of risk assessment scales. In general, however, we are better at predicting things in the near future than 20 years down the road. So those are a couple of caveats in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about risk assessment. Now, sometimes people also get risk assessment and needs assessment confused. Sometimes they're connected, but they're not always. Sometimes all you're trying to do is just predict the likelihood of somebody recidivating, and that's it. You're not responsible for doing something about it, all right? Other times, you might be in a position where your agency is charged with trying to do something about it, change that person's risk. So that's what we call a needs assessment. You're trying to assess not only how this person's likelihood of recidivating, but what are the things that are contributing to the likelihood going up or down? We call those needs. And ideally, if you have a strategy in place for dealing with those needs, you can develop a risk management strategy where you put into place different treatments, different expectations that are communicated to people, supervision strategies that help manage that risk, all right? So we have risk assessment, which is sometimes also tied together with the needs assessment, which leads to a risk management plan. But recognize, sometimes all the agency might be interested in is risk assessment. So different scales can do different things. Different strategies can have different objectives. We want to talk about why do we need risk assessment. Well, the first reason we need risk assessment is, in corrections and criminal justice, is that recidivism happens a lot. This is not a surprise to you. You all work in the system. Perhaps you know these numbers, maybe not. This is a large national study. They took 400,000 state inmates from, I think it was 15 or 20 different states across the country in 2005. They let them out. They were going out anyways. And they simply looked at how many of them were rearrested, how many of them were reconvicted, how many of them were sent back to prison. When you look at just the rearrest rates, we're talking 3/4 of the people leaving our state prisons end up being rearrested. That is a phenomenal figure when you think about it. It's not a positive sign of our efficacy in dealing with this problem. We need to be able to figure out, when you think about the costs of that recidivism, there's costs in terms of the system costs, victim costs, lost social capital cost. It's an expensive process. We need to figure out how we can address that and move that in the right direction. So one of the reasons we need risk assessment is to be able to identify the people who are likely to be on that curve there and recidivating. We also need to understand that the research over the past 15, 20 years keeps growing and saying that if we pay attention to risk in the criminal justice system, if we focus our efforts on the offenders that are at highest risk and focus on meeting their treatment needs with appropriate interventions, we get better bang for the buck in our criminal justice system. We can actually significantly reduce that recidivism curve when we do this. Risk is central to that process. The whole risk needs responsivity process kind of a model is based on reliably assessing risk, differentiating offenders into different risk categories. So we are better as a system when we do that. That's probably true. Most of the time we talk about this in corrections, but it's also probably true on the front end in terms of law enforcement. We don't talk about risk assessment in law enforcement a whole lot. Probably need to be doing that more. Why else do we need risk assessment? Well, in some cases it's mandated by law that you do it. We don't always recognize this. You all probably know that House Bill 3194 says some stuff about risk, that we need to be focusing on first assessing risk and identifying strategies to target medium and high risk offenders. That's inherent in 3194. But another area risk comes up is in the domestic violence law that the state has. So in Oregon, if there's a concern about dual aggression and officers, if officer arrives at a scene and it looks like both people have been physically aggressive, the officers are told, you're supposed to try and look at this to identify the primary aggressor. And one of the things they're being told that they should be doing is thinking about the potential for future assaults. They're being told by the law to do risk assessment. They're not told how to do it or trained how to do that, though. So risk assessment is part of our criminal justice laws, and some agencies, the decisions that they're making are inherently based on risk. Pretrial release is really about risk. Making the decision to let somebody out, that's the presumptive decision, but to hold them back, to not let them out, is a risk assessment process. It's what danger do they present to the community that we don't think we can effectively manage, and are they likely to come back to court? That is inherent in that job is risk assessment. So we have a lot of good reasons to do risk assessment. Here's another one. When our criminal justice system makes reliable decisions on how we handle cases, makes accurate decisions in how we can handle cases, when we make decisions that are efficient and timely, and when we make decisions that are unbiased by gender issues, by race issues, by ethnicity issues, we probably, under those circumstances, enhance the perceived legitimacy of the criminal justice system, right? At least in law enforcement, at this country, at this time, we're experiencing a crisis in legitimacy in terms of law enforcement. The more transparent we can be about decision-making, consistent, unbiased we can be, the more efficient we can be, we will probably enhance the perceptions of legitimacy and trust in our criminal justice system. We would argue that all of that can be enhanced with well-established risk assessment practices. All right? So there's lots of different reasons to do risk assessment. And it is widely recognized that risk assessment is a central part of every single decision that we make in the criminal justice system. The Supreme Court has weighed in on this and said they recognize that assessing risk is a fundamental factor in the decisions that we make and how we handle cases. You look at every single decision point in the criminal justice system. Victims. Victims don't always report their crimes. The likelihood that somebody might come back and do it again to them probably influences whether or not they report that crime. Certainly is with domestic violence cases. Officers arrive at a scene. They sometimes have discretion about whether or not to make an arrest. We know for a doubt that officers, at least subjectively, make the decision of arresting somebody in part based on their assessment of how dangerous this person is. How likely are they to continue in this behavior? Prosecutors clearly form some impressions of how dangerous somebody might be, how serious of an offender this person is. Their decisions to proceed with charges, even potentially what to charge somebody with, what to do with plea agreements, is in part influenced by their perceptions of how dangerous this person is or the likelihood that they'll return to a criminal activity. All throughout the criminal justice system, risk is an inherent process in terms of that's going on, at least behind the scenes, because it's not always transparent. There are, of course, lots of other factors that influence the decisions that we make. Nature of the case, the evidence, a sense of perceived justice, victims' input. But risk is still a component of decision-making that probably all of you engage in. So, how are risk assessments actually being done in the criminal justice system? I want to move into talking about that now. Well, if you look at how our laws are structured and the way, lots of decisions are made, certainly one of the ways that we try to incorporate risk, perceived risk, in our decision-making has to do with the nature of the offense. There is a tendency when somebody has committed a more egregious crime, that they've used a weapon, injured the victim, made more serious threats, that the more serious the crime, there is a perception out there that that's probably a factor in terms of how likely that person is to continue engaging in criminal behavior. So we use the current offense to make some decisions about predicting this person's future involvement in crime. The challenge with using severity of the index crime as a risk factor in our risk assessment is that the research suggests this doesn't work very well. Surprisingly enough, the person who commits a crime with a gun and injures the victim, a more serious offense, you compare that to people who've committed a less serious offense, and you're looking at just that one offense, it actually is not associated with their likelihood of recidivism. There's some suggestion in some bodies of research that it's actually an inverse relationship. For example, murderers as a group have a fairly low recidivism rate. All right? This is a study with some meta-analysis with 64 different studies involving mentally disordered offenders, and they looked at across these studies different measures of the severity of the index offense. And what you see if you can squint really, really down, if you can really good at squinting down to being able to see that text, is you see that some of these indexes, like it was a violent index versus a nonviolent index, in this study it was actually inversely associated with recidivism risk. The more serious the crime, the less likely they were to recidivate. Now, there's methodological problems in this because they might have spent more time in prison, they might have gotten more treatment. There's issues there. But when we look at the severity of a single offense, which is used a lot in terms of forming our impression of how dangerous somebody is, when we look at that from a research perspective, it doesn't hold up. What does work better is how long the person has been offending, the total number of offenses the person is engaged in, the diversity of their criminal behavior, right? Characteristics of a single incident don't do a great job of predicting the future. Patterns of behavior is what works a lot better. So we do pay attention to the index offense in making some decisions. From an evidence, research-based perspective, we'd say there's things that will do a lot better than that. So how else do we do risk assessment in the criminal justice system? Well, the most common form of risk assessment done by police, by prosecutors, not so much corrections these days, because corrections adopted a lot of risk assessment strategies that we'll talk about in a minute. But police, courts, other folks, mental health professionals who are doing evaluations, often it's based on unstructured professional judgment. It's the hair on the back of your neck approach, right? I've been in law enforcement, I've been in psychology, I've been in psychiatry, I've been in the courts for 15 years now. And this guy scares the hell out of me, all right? Whether we're willing to acknowledge that or not, the reality is a lot of decisions are made based on that subjective, maybe even subconscious reaction to people, all right? That's what we call unstructured professional judgment. That is the most common way decisions are still made if you look at the criminal justice system as a whole. What else do we have? What's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is pure numbers, actuarial techniques. All right? Actuarial risk assessment is where you do research, identify risk factors, possible risk factors, and you throw some fancy math at this stuff to come up with a prediction model. And it's purely mechanical. There's no decision-making, really, that goes into the scoring of this. All right? That's really the opposite of unstructured professional judgment. This is done in all sorts of fields. You can go online and do a how long will I live calculation. You may or may not want to do this, depending upon your lifestyle choices. All right? I will confess, it looks like I'm going to live to 95. I'm not sure if I want to live to 95. I've seen grandparents that have made it that far. It's not always a pretty scene, right? How do they do this? Well, they collected data. This is a study that was done on over 500,000 people where they collected data on height, weight, current age, health habits like alcohol. That is true, by the way, although I do occasionally have a little Kahlua at night with milk, but I figured the milk is offsetting, so I didn't count that. I don't count that as a drink. All right? I exercise a fair amount. Yeah, that's me, super happy. My kids wouldn't always agree with that, though, of course, So you plug in all these factors, and literally they're predicting how long I'm going to live. All right? So that suggests to me that I need to make sure I have a lot of money saved for retirement. Which is true, by the way. You need to think about, make sure you know how your likelihood of living because there's a lot of people that are completely underfunded, grossly underfunded in terms of your retirement accounts, given how long you're probably going to live. All right? This is all based on an actuarial assessment. And we do the same thing in risk assessment in criminal justice realm. This is a scale. Some of you have probably heard about this. This is something called the Static 99. It's a scale created by Carl Hansen for predicting recidivism among sex offenders. It's a simple process. These are the items that you look at, the parallel to the items that were on this other scale, right? Instead of looking at height and weight, they're looking at, is the person currently young? Young's bad, right? Being young is not a positive thing when it comes to recidivism, sadly. If you are under 25, you get 1 point. Living with an intimate partner, that's a good thing, at least for men. Some research has suggested it might be counterproductive, not for female offenders, but women overall. It doesn't work quite as well for men as it does for men. But if you've lived with an intimate partner in this, right, you get a 0. If you have not, you get a 1. Then look at prior sex offenses, other types of offenses. Basically, you add up all those points. Here's what that does in terms of recidivism when you look at sexual offending within a period of 5 years. If you got no points on this scale, offender with no points, only 5% of them recidivated with a new offense within that 5-year time frame. If you had 6 or more points on this scale, 39%. That's the utility of that scale. All right? It's showing you, helping to differentiate the offenders in a very effective way with a very simple mechanical actuarial process. That's the other end of the spectrum compared to unstructured professional judgment. There is something in between. We call that structured professional judgment. That is where you do research on what are the things that are associated with the recidivism. And during a risk assessment process, you collect information on those set things. But the clinician, the person doing the rating, has the latitude to weight them differently and add them up differently. There's not a mechanical scoring process, but it provides a guide to guide your decision making. And it's research-based because the factors on the scale are evidence-based. All right? If you want to learn more about that, a great book, Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto. How many of you have read that book? Awesome book, right? He goes in and he talks about why is it that the airlines have gotten so safe? You know, there was a point in time when getting on an airplane was actually, quite risky. I mean, think about how safe it is today, right? They have developed protocols for emergency situations. When Sully Sullenberger was flying and the bird struck both engines, the very first thing they did is they consulted the checklist. Right? So he's been looking at, Atul Gawande's been looking at, hey, that's made the airline industry safe because under complex decision-making tasks, people don't do very well without guidance, right? Without checklists, without structured support. So he's been doing research on what happens when you do that with surgical procedures. The sad reality is a lot more people die from medical complications than are killed by criminal justice professionals out in the field. Not to diminish the impact and the importance of that, but there's a lot of people who die from simple medical errors. Things like leaving sponges in the body, right? Amputating the wrong limb. There's a lot of medical errors that occur. And they're finding you can actually reduce some of those errors by having simple protocols, simple checklists that people go through. Like somebody counts the sponges at the beginning and they count the sponges at the end. It's not rocket science, right? But having that checklist structures the decision-making that occurs. All right, those are the different forms of risk assessment. Which one works better? Which strategy works better? They have compared, people have done studies, and then people have done studies on those studies called meta-analyses. They've done this for 20 years plus years now, predicting lots of different outcomes. We're interested in criminal justice outcomes, but other people are interested in different things like hiring decisions. And what they find is that if you compare subjective decision-making to actuarial methods consistently do better in a range of different fields. That includes corrections in the criminal justice system. It includes educational decision-making, personnel hiring decisions, how people will respond to different medical treatments, and yes, it even involves baseball, right? If you've seen the movie Moneyball, it's all about the old codgers who used to go out and, find the new recruits by, their own experience and what they've done and what they've seen. I like the cut of his jib, whatever that means, right? I know it's a sailing reference, but I don't really know what it is, right? that's what they used to do. And in Oakland A's, they decided, let's put some data to this. Let's start putting some actual prediction models in place. Let's use actuarial methods. And at least for a time, they did better. Then sadly, all the other teams started doing the same thing, so they caught up. All right? But we know that structured and actuarial methods do better. Why is that? Well, first off, when you use unstructured methods, there's a number of problems with those. First of all, most of us are overconfident in our ability to predict different outcomes. It's like when you ask, how many of you are a pretty good driver? Right? Not too many people confess to being a crappy driver. Right? We have a tendency to be overconfident. And that means that we're not actually learning from our errors. I remember all the predictions, like the Patriots this last Super Bowl. I remember all the predictions I was right, but all the times that I was wrong, distant memory. Knock that out. All right? So because we're overconfident, we don't learn from our mistakes. We see what we want to see. That's also a concern in terms of the confirmatory bias. Human beings are great at this. You form an initial impression, and we develop initial impressions of people very quickly, subconsciously. And then, whatever that impression is, you look for evidence to support it. Let's be honest, that happens, right? We do this in our relationships all the time. Arguments, I'm really good at remembering all the things that were done wrong to me. The stuff that I did was problematic, forget it, right? We're good at confirming our own beliefs. That happens in risk assessment when it's done subjectively as well. It's also true that subjective decision-making when it comes to risk is problematic because it has poor reliability. Two different evaluators looking at the same case often come to a different outcome, different decision. That can be pretty important in the criminal justice system. There was a study that was done with a sexually violent predator law in Florida. To be designated as a sexually violent predator and civilly committed after you've served your whole sentence requires two things. You have to have high risk based on a risk assessment to engage in new sexual offenses, and somebody's got to diagnose you with a mental disorder that may impact your behavior. They did research on this. They found 400 cases where two different mental health professionals had evaluated these people, and they compared the inter-rater reliability of the two assessors. And a very high percentage of the time, they didn't agree on whether or not a mental health problem was evident. People are going away for long periods of time, civilly committed, based on measures, approaches with poor reliability. So there's a number of reasons why unstructured professional judgment doesn't work quite as well. Which does raise the question, if we know, based on decades of research now, in a range of different fields, that actuarial and structured methods are better at predicting outcomes, whether or not that's in the criminal justice realm or school decisions, whatever, why are we still using those other methods? It begins to raise ethical concerns. If you're continuing to rely on unstructured professional judgment, the hair on the back of your neck, you're really engaging potentially in unethical practices. All right? And again, corrections really has fully embraced risk assessment. But there's other areas of the criminal justice system that's not the case. How many actuarial risk assessment scales or formally developed risk assessment scales are there for police decision making? There's lots of decisions that they make. They're at the front end of the criminal justice system. Are they using actuarial methods? Decision-making guides? Not nearly as much as corrections is. So we definitely have room for improvement. All right, I'm going to stop there, and my younger colleague, who has more recently gone through all the stats kind of stuff, the stuff that I've purged long ago from my memory banks, he's going to cover the basic process of developing risk scales and learning how we evaluate them.
Thank you, Chris. And And just what Phil would mention, I was a former probation officer, so I had the experience of conducting a lot of risk assessments. So I love being at conferences like this with practitioners, but also if you're like me, we're asked to use these risk assessments, but the question is, how are they developed? What goes into their construction? So we thought it would be really instructive to just sort of walk through what we do as researchers when we're creating or validating a risk assessment. And we chose to use the public safety checklist just as an example here to sort of walk through the steps. I understand that there might be some debates on people's preference for the public safety checklist, so maybe just set that aside and we'll just walk through the process of how do we come up with this tool and how you might do one yourself if you're an agency or a jurisdiction that's thinking about constructing a risk assessment to sort of fill in some of the gaps that Chris mentioned where we don't have an actuarial risk assessment. So again, you're all probably familiar with the public safety checklist. One of the interesting things is that risk assessments come a long way. We used to have to fill out a piece of paper and manually score, add up the zeros and ones to figure out what we have. This is a tool like many others that's available online, and it sort of calculates those numbers for you. Because believe it or not, when we looked at some of the research and the old way of doing things, officers even adding up small numbers would get it wrong, and that might equate to supervising someone on a low or high, meeting that cutoff. Now, the first thing we have to do when we're figuring out, okay, we want to have a risk instrument to do something, we have to pick a population or a group that we're trying to make predictions about. Are we looking at juveniles? Are we looking at adults? Do we want to do folks inside an institution? For the public safety checklist, what they looked at were offenders that were released from prison or were starting probation. So this is a community sample, right? The next thing you have to think about is, well, what is important to predict? What is the outcome that we're interested? What do we define as recidivism or some sort of adverse outcome? Here, the decision was made to use a new person crime. And you also have to figure out, well, how long do we want to look at before we'd figure out that is someone that we would count as recidivate? Do we want to use 1 year, 3 years? Here, the selection was to use 5 years. And then it's really just a matter of finding cases to sort of to construct the study. In this initial study, they had more than 56,000 felony offenders, and this was between 2000 and 2005, so a 5-year time period. Now, you first have to collect information on all the possible risk factors. And Chris mentioned that there are these, you've got risk factors, and he also mentioned that there are some need factors. You've probably heard this in other places, but you have this difference between static, or things that don't change, and then dynamic risk factors that are changeable. We really like this recent breakdown by Monahan and Jennifer Scheme, which actually breaks it out a little bit more in where you have a couple different type of static and a couple different dynamic, which I think are just instructive to kind of to think about, which you have these unchangeable static, what they call fixed, or things like gender. Things like whether or not you had a prior felony arrest, or you were arrested earlier than the age of 16. Then we have other static factors that you can't change with intervention, but they actually do change, and that would be somebody's age, right? So yes, as you get older, generally you're less likely to engage in crime, but we really can't speed up that age process. So that, again, it's a static variable. Now, they also break down the two type of dynamic into those. Both of these are changeable by intervention, but the latter group, the causal risk factors, as the term they used, are the ones that, if you change them, have the larger reduction in recidivism, right? So these are the things, the antisocial attitude, the antisocial peers. These are the things that we really want to focus on, especially in terms of the corrections treatment perspective. So once we collect information on all the different risk factors, this is just an example here using the inmates who were released from state prison in 1994. What you can see is now we're breaking these down, so we've got the variable gender, age, and prior arrest. And all three of these, as you know from research and prior experience, are pretty good predictors of criminal behavior. So you can see that the males have a slightly more, nearly 70% recidivism rate compared to a little under 60%. So there's about a 10% difference there. Age, as it makes sense, that the younger folks recidivate at a higher rate, and once you get to 45, there's a big drop here. So these would all be pretty good risk factors to start to work with. Now, we'd also, if you're thinking about, what other types would we want to include? Well, we know from lots of theory, decades of theory, that there are some predictors that are better than others, right? And Andrews and Bonta have talked about the big four, and those being, criminal history, antisocial peers, antisocial attitude, antisocial personality. And those are the ones, through meta-analytic research, have found the biggest effect size. But there's also others, right? They talk about the central 8, those including, work and family, substance abuse, that are also predictive as well. So the more information you have at time 1, the better tool that you can develop. For the PSC, there was a few different databases that the researchers drew from, looking at the state arrest records, the DOC files, as well as the judicial data. And here's some of the information that was collected: age, criminal history, prior incarceration, and the like. Just because I was a little confused when I first read this study, the person crime kind of threw me off. This is just a short partial list of what some of those offenses that meet this criteria. And then we would simply code anyone who had any of these things, whether it's an assault or endangering the welfare of minor. Anyone who had these would be coded 0 or 1. So now we have, that's our time 2 variable. And what we need to do, and the next step, is to figure out which one of these risk factors are associated with the time 2 recidivism outcome. And here's just an example using just one variable, age. And you can see that as we correlate these two together, there is this bit of overlap, right? And this makes sense, theoretically, that age at first arrest is going to be somewhat predictive of recidivism. And so we would say that, age explains some bit of who's going to engage in crime. Now, it's not perfect. If it was completely overlapped, that would be a correlation of 1. As Chris mentioned, there's no ability for us at this point to get to absolute prediction. But age is a pretty good predictor. Here you'd see that it's actually younger age at first arrest is associated with a higher likelihood for new person crime. So there's a negative correlation. And the breakdown, as you can see by the percentages in each of these groups, under 18 is about 41%, and over 26 is much less. We had a question.
Don't you run into sample size problems pretty quickly here? I mean, 50,000 arrests over a 5-year period, 50,000 offenders sounds like a lot, but that's about 10,000 a year, and once you break it down demographically, you're getting into smaller sample sizes quickly. So what do you do to make sure your data are valid?
Sure, yeah, so what we would do a lot of times, and I can't speak, I wasn't the researcher on the initial, right, but what we would do is we look at things like we would bin the age, right? So we wouldn't have age as a variable that is anyone who's 47, right? Everyone that's over 26 falls into this group. So we would look at what the variables, what variation we have in any variable to make sure that there's enough to predict. Because if you don't have, let's say that it's a sample that didn't have any people under 25, right, or there was just a small percent, it wouldn't predict well. So yeah, those are some issues. And age is probably a bad one because there usually is a pretty good range, especially when you're talking about 56,000 offenders. But there could be some others that would fall into that category for sure. Now, that was just one variable that we were looking at. Obviously, in a risk assessment, we want to construct a number of variables. Here we were adding, that maybe is a little hard to see, but we have age of first arrest. Now we're adding the total number of arrests, right? Another variable that we know is predictive. And you can see that each of them is correlated with recidivism, but this middle piece is actually some of what we call the shared prediction. So these are folks, we're not really getting, age at first arrest is already telling us this bit. We're really only adding this extra part here to the model in terms of advancing the prediction, is this independent or this unique, what we're going to gather. So what we're going to do, you can see that under that model, yes, they would want to include both of these in a risk measure. And you might want to continue to add more variables and more variables. But at some point, you're going to reach sort of this diminishing marginal returns, where if you were to, say, add in total property arrests, which is going to be pretty correlated with the total number of arrests, maybe, thank you. You're not really getting much more bang for your buck, right? So that you might want to look at some other type of variables or just use the other two, right? So that there's some construction of these that is going to have the best sort of prediction. The other issue is that this isn't always done in risk assessment, but we know that some variables have a stronger weight. I mentioned that the big four predictors are stronger than some of the others. You could see here in this just fictitious example that age at first arrest is explaining a lot more of the variance than the total number of arrests. So the standard way of constructing risk assessments is what they call the Burgess method, where we'd simply count. If you don't have that variable, it's a 0. If you get the points, you get a 1, and it's just the summation. There's other ways to think about how you might weight some of these variables differently. So here, maybe, age at first arrest in some way is counted as 2 points or some other higher value. And once we figure out all of that, we simply sum up all the total scores, and we look at or the points or the weights, and now we have sort of this variable. We don't usually, the goal is to put them into some sort of categorization, right? So we're not going to look at having numbers from 1 to 100%. That really doesn't make sense. We want to look at, well, let's bin these into maybe low, medium, or high risk offenders. And this gets a little tricky when you have an offender who's perhaps has a risk assessment, two different type of risk assessments. One says that he's low risk, and another one says that he's high. A good example would be someone who scores low on the LSI or something in the community, and that predicts general recidivism. But on the ODARA, let's say it's a sex offender, he might be a high risk for a sex offense, but generally a low risk for just general offending. So you really have to think about what it is that you want to do with the tool and how you want to construct sort of how many of these different categories do you want. Now, if you're defining high risk, we could define it as maybe, a 10% chance. If this was something like violence or a new sex offense, we might say, wow, 10% likelihood, that would be something that would be in the high risk group. But something perhaps like technical violations on probation or parole, maybe we're looking at maybe something closer to 50%. There's just no rule here. Those are decisions that have to be made by the folks that are constructing the tool. Now, once we look at, another thing to consider is not only what percentage of folks do they fall into that recidivate, but also where does the population fall on this scale? So look, using the PSC again, obviously we're going from scores of 0. We didn't have anybody with 1.0, but you see that you've got a pretty good curve here where most of the offenders fall somewhere in the middle, and there's less at both extremes. Now, if this was, to say example, it was lopsided and there was a whole bunch of people up here on this other end where you've got 50 or 60%, and we were then to call those high risk, the risk assessment's not really doing a whole bunch because you're probably within your agency, you want to define some smaller amount of high risk that you're going to do something different with, whether you give them more supervision or more treatment or something. If everybody falls into that group, then the tool hasn't really helped you out in any way. You want to identify those that are at the highest risk. For the public safety checklist, they're using scores of 0.4, 1, or higher to be defined as that high risk. One of the issues, or one of the things that comes up when we're talking about risk prediction, and it kind of gets back to the Griggs example that you gave, is sometimes people will say, okay, this person scored a 62%, therefore he's got a 62% chance of recidivating. That's not, the words in that are a little tricky. They're not exactly accurate. What we should rather say is that 62% of the people in the developmental scale with a similar score recidivated within 5 years based on this outcome. So you got to be careful about saying things like, even if it's not 100%, you got to be kind of careful there. When you're choosing a risk assessment or what you want to use, there's a lot of factors, more than what we're able to discuss here in just an hour. But one of them is ease of use, right? If you have a tool that's overly complicated or has too many items, it's not likely that the agency is going to really use it and it's going to be valuable to them. And Chris mentioned the reliability, right? When we start thinking about if we're going to this actuarial measure, we need to make sure that two raters are rating the same person similarly. And you can see here that if we have low reliability, they're all over the place. We might as well just use our gut feeling. We also have to pay attention to accuracy, though. We could all be reliable. Officers could all score the person in the same way, but you can see here they're not really on the target. Maybe they're not scoring the items the way that they were designed. And to the extent that that's true, we're not really going to be able to predict very well. And that really has to do with kind of training and monitoring and the like. Another issue here is what's defined as shrinkage. I guess I'll remember the Seinfeld episode. If you're to take a tool that's constructed on a different sample for a different purpose, let's say we've got a Canadian sample and it's in a community, and you're going to take that risk assessment they developed, you're going to put it here in the United States, and you're going to use it in an institution, right? It's not going to be as predictive as perhaps it did in that other sample. So you got to make sure that we're looking at the same type of outcome with the same type of offenders. And one of the ways we can tell, how we evaluated tools, whether it's how good it is to look at the predictive accuracy. I'm sure you've all heard these terms, but when there's a couple different ways that researchers talk about predictive accuracy. You most often probably hear correlation or the R value. The PSC had a R of 0.29, which indicated that as you went up in the score or in the categories, that there's an increase in the likelihood that they'd recidivate. The AUC value is also something, or the area under the curve. The value is 0.70, and how you interpret that's relatively easy. It's just that there's a 70% chance that a randomly selected person from the recidivist group would have a higher score on that scale than a randomly selected non-recidivist. So if you can imagine that if you had a AUC score of 0.50, what that would mean is the tool didn't do very well because you pick one and then the other. You might as well flip a coin, and that's going to tell you about as predictive as the risk assessment. So we want to have a higher value here. I thought that this would be kind of instructive in looking at, well, okay, how do we got the value, it's statistically significant, but where does that fall in terms of, is that a good measure? I use the Rice and Harris, their sort of rule of thumb, and you can see that values of 0.1, 0.24, and 0.37 are indicative of small, medium, and then large effects. And that the AUC, if you get 0.71, that's considered a large effect. So that's really where we would like to be with our risk assessment measures, is to be obviously as high as we can be. So where do they stack up? Well, you can see that this is just looking at the study looking at the predictive accuracy of a number of tools that were predicting violence. And that you can see the PSC had an AUC value of 0.7, which is right on that cusp of the high, moderate, low, high group. And once we have overall, you have the tool does well, has a pretty good predictive accuracy. You do also want to look at maybe there's some subgroups to make sure that the tool is working for. One of the ones that comes to mind that was discussed earlier today, I think, is maybe gender. Looking at, okay, let's separate and look at, do men and women, does this tool work for them? You can see that although there is a little bit of a difference in the tool's ability in this study, it's not statistically significant. So it did work well for men and women. If there was a difference in the tool, you might have to start to consider, well, maybe we need to look at some different items or maybe a different assessment for this group that it doesn't work as well on. Now, as Chris mentioned, with this sort of, we have this idea that the actuarial assessment does do a better job, but there's times and there's places where the tool might say that the person's low risk, but there's something going on about the person or their situation. You could think about maybe there's a death of someone in the family, or there's some situation, they lost their job, and that really kind of elevates their sort of their risk in some way. That's somewhat of a subjective interpretation. Maybe there's a gut feeling that you have that maybe the tool's telling me one thing, but something's going on. And so, Andrews and Bonta long talked about this idea of the override principle, that in addition to risk need responsivity, you had to sort of have this professional judgment that would, that you'd use. The problem with that, however, is that some agencies rely too heavily on that judgment, and they really have found that in comparisons of those who were overridden for their risk score, what they found is those didn't predict as well. The actual tool did better overall, and they really recommend that you use no more than 5 or 10% overrides on any of these assessments. So how would we use this? Well, we have the assessment scale, right? Those that are high risk get higher involvement, whether that's longer sentence, whether that's more treatment, et cetera. Then we have our structured professional judgment, so that smaller group that there's something there would go into high risk, and then we've got other factors that would kind of bump them up. And for everybody else, they kind of fall into some range of lower CJ involvement. Now, there are a number of tools out there. If you're thinking about, I really want to adopt something, you probably all heard of most of these. If you're thinking about, we need something to predict sexual recidivism, the static 99 is one of the most famous. If you've got any of these other number of offenses, there's other tools for that. There's also, I've kind of grouped these into, these are just risk assessments with more the risk factors. But then there are these risk needs tools, which take a little bit more time, use more in community supervision or in incarceration. And so you can really just go ahead and pick one of these, and as long as you're, the folks that you're working with are somewhat similar to that, this would be a good tool to have. The other thing that you can do is develop your own scale, right? You can work with your research folks or contract with others to sort of use your data, and then you have a tool that is built, with your own system, with your own type of offenders. And I think that's, another way that you can go about risk assessment. And so I think that's all we had. That's all we had here. I don't know if we have time for questions, but we're open to that. We've got about 4 minutes for questions if anybody has anything to say. Oh, yes. Thank you. Oh. Did you have a question, miss? We got time. Okay, sure.